Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Straight Talk with Bren and Tim Rowe from The Straight. Brought to you by our sponsors, Inglis and Darley. Today, new leadership at the ATC. What does that mean? Darren Beedman finds his way to Chris Waller, and an extensive chat to Will Freedman about the costs of training, the challenges of training, and the opportunities of training. In Bren and Bloodstock, why is Australia's 2-year-old racing on the decline? 200 winners up for a modern great, and the 12-month cycle of the digital market. Finally, in wagering, do bookies really want to bet on racing? And how does international racing shape Australian wagering? Tim, great to have you here as always. Big week of news. Early in the week, we learnt that the ATC have elected a new chairman, Tim Hale, and a new vice chair in Caroline Searcy. Is this the dawn of a new era, Tim, or will the old politics still rule the roost?
There will still be some there's never not politics in racing, is there? So I'm sure there will be, but these are two member elected directors that are, chair and vice chair. As you know, Bren, our phones were running hot on Sunday ahead of the election or the vote that was brought forward a week by what we're told. And Caroline Searcy, congratulations to her as vice chair, held the casting vote, I believe, or was sort of being lobbied pretty heavily. She's free to make her own decisions, and certainly I'm certain she did, but there's plenty of lobbying, and she received plenty of phone calls on Sunday and Monday ahead of that meeting. And yeah, Tim Hale and now Caroline are leading the ATC ship, and see where it goes.
Yeah, I guess the same challenges persist for the club beyond the Rosehill debate. Questions about the future business model, the decline in wagering revenue through the tab distribution, there's talks of executive change, the club. How do they execute the Rosehill development now? Some parts of Rosehill will probably still be sold off or redeveloped, which has been a plan for the club since 2016. What happens to Warwick Farm? It's been unloved. There's going to be it's been so many iterations ago. It was $800 million spent on Warwick Farm. Tim, that's clearly not going to happen now. What goes on with Randwick? How to develop that? There's discussions about Canterbury, the excess land there. Can it be redeveloped? There's so many things that this ATC board needs to discuss and develop plans around. There is a feeling, I guess, Tim, that this is just the start of a new journey. The Rosehill situation, the 18 months of distraction and arguments and political inquiry hasn't resolved the fact that the ATC needs to solve a problem, which is that its bottom line needs to continue to improve if it's going to sustain itself and continue to build facilities to host racing in Sydney.
Yeah, and then, as you say, Camellia development, what happens with Canterbury? Speaking to some of the ATC directors, I think they want to, at the end of the day, they're a racing club. Yes, they need to balance the books and how they manage that. But at the end of the day, they're a racing club. They want to hold good racing. That's the carnival's coming up. There is a lot to look forward to, and I think there'll be a focus on that as well to, come along to the races, bet on the races, have a good time.
Confirmation this week, Tim, that Darren Beedman heads to Chris Waller's stable. It's good to see one of the most highly regarded professionals and one of the most respected professionals, arguably, one of the best jockeys the last 50 years in Australia, get an opportunity to further his skills at another major stable. A positive result for Beedman, but I think a positive for Waller as well, because Chris has tended to bring a lot of young guys through that stable. To have someone of such experience to come in and lend that experience and lend that understanding can only be a benefit to what is already one of Australia's most dominant stables.
For sure, we've seen with Zach Lloyd was apprenticed to under James Cummings and Godolphin, and I think Darren had a big influence there and helped his career. And so internally, I'm sure he's going to have an influence, and externally, which I'm sure came into Chris's thinking of employing Darren, is there's still an aura around him. People want to speak to him. He's very good in front of the camera at the races. So he's going to attract owners as well, I'm sure, to go, well, you know what, I want to be able to speak to Darren at the races and, reminisce about the great old times of Lonhro and Saintly and all these different great horses that he rode. And, he's just a very personable, great guy, and fantastic that he gets to continue his career in racing and it's not lost to the industry.
Yeah, another significant part of that story is that Chris Waller will take over the Carbine Lodge stables at Flemington. Obviously, an end of an era there with the Cummings family involvement and what goes on with that. But I think it's an interesting pivot for Waller. He hasn't had a great great record in Melbourne outside probably Group 1 races in the past couple of years, Tim. So it does probably indicate that, particularly as Kieran Maher's expanded more and more into Sydney and New South Wales and the footprint there, that Waller's plans are quite national as well. And it does should set them up well moving forward in terms of capacity and what they can do out of that base.
For sure, and a bit of breaking news this morning is that Tony and Calvin McAvoy are going to, well, they say it's not an expansion, they're just taking over Chris's old Flemington boxes with, so they're going to move some of their horses from Ballarat to Flemington as well. So that's happening, and yeah, it's sort of an interesting one with, you see it with Anthony and Sam Freedman, the focus on Sydney. Mick Price has got a Sydney stable. Yeah, how do they balance that and ensure both stables are successful? And as you say, obviously Chris is the premier Sydney trainer and has been for a long time. Yeah, it's outside the spring and autumns, whether he could have a bit more success in the run-of-the-mill Saturday Metro races or Melbourne Victorian races from Carbine Lodge will be interesting to see how it plays out.
And those who sort of reminisce of those old days of Flemington and Bart Cummings and all those people, I urge you to check out Matt Stewart's article about Leon Corstons today, reflecting on that era and the new era of Corstons on Malura Racing as it is, and sort of obviously they've got some good horses going around with Troy and Will Larkin now, obviously working with Leon, but he's one of those great connections back to that era, which is one of an iconic era of Australian racing. And you may recall last week we chatted about the cost of training and ownership, and we're lucky to have trainer Will Freedman join us, chat through some of those points that were raised last week in the podcast from a trainer's perspective. Will, thanks so much. I guess let's take this conversation from a more broader sense. And yeah, you not only have your own experience to lean on, but obviously your dad's experience as well, given you work in a partnership with him. What is the biggest challenge to the training business model at the moment, do you feel?
Well, the biggest challenge for trainers is the fact that anywhere between a very lean business that probably runs, on the very leaner side is still between, say, 50 to 60% of your turnover goes to staffing costs. So it's a very heavy labor reliant business. So, and it's only getting bigger. Because we're particularly in Sydney, because where a lot of the training is, the metropolitan training anyway, is done in the city rather than your Cranbons and your Pakenhams and that in Melbourne, which has been an accepted place to train for metropolitan horses. And don't get me wrong, Chris Lees and Nathan Doyle and others do great jobs away from the city tracks, but the vast majority of the metropolitan trainers are in Sydney, and the cost of living in Sydney is a very real issue that a lot of people understand, a lot of owners understand. We saw it in the AFL with Kohler as well, that got removed and then it's back on the agenda. It's sort of same sort of problems. And I remember before I went training on my own, we were employing ground staff, so like your strappers and stable hands, and they were getting paid about $18 to $20 an hour. That was the sort of going rate, and that's probably 10 to 12 years ago. So like significant amount of time. Now they're getting paid anywhere, but like the minimum are getting paid 30 and probably up towards $38 an hour for an experienced casual stable hand. So that's the stable hands. And then riders is a similar sort of story. We were paying riders. I remember the best riders at Rose Hill were getting paid $1,000 a week before tax. And that was pretty good money for a track work rider that only rode track work. And then, I don't know, about 2 or 3 years later, it was clear $1,000, which probably gets you up around, I would say, around 65 odd thousand. Now the better track work riders would be getting paid upwards of 85,000, 90,000. The better ones at big stables are probably getting closer towards 100,000 for 3 to 4 hours work Monday to Saturday. It's the cost of training in terms of a lot of the other costs. I always when I have owners that come in, and sorry to digress a little bit further, but when we have owners that come in, they're always shocked at how many services the horses are actually given, even though they see it on their bill. It's like when you see it in operation, you've got vets every morning, you've got farriers that are here every day looking after the feet of horses, you've got physiotherapists coming in, you've got the feed coming in on a weekly basis, so you get fresh feed, and you're getting hay delivered every week. You're getting, while you're in city stables, you don't have the capacity to store as much as rural locations where they can store hay and they can have big feed mills. And and when you have so many people clipping the ticket, the trainer actually acts a bit like a bank, because we have to pay the service providers on time. Otherwise, they stop coming. So while an owner probably is supposed to have 30 days, but we're not under any illusion that every owner pays on time, they essentially get a credit run because there are other people in the horse that are paying their bills. So if a 5% shareholder hasn't paid for 90 days, but the other 95% have, and they don't know each other, it's very difficult to then be like, actually, we're not going to run your horse because there's a 5% shareholder of which we put in the horse because we syndicated it, and saying we're not going to run it until you've paid. So like, but by and large, the main driver of a training business is staff, and that's the main, that's taking a lot of our turnover.
Will, are owners cognizant of that fact? Personally, I don't think owners. I think they are aware of the costs that go in, or most of them. That certainly the ones I deal with. That I don't think trainers are, making a fortune out of training fees. It probably is the add-ons that some don't understand, or the vets, and that, as you say, you're taking the risk of having to pay service providers, and it's not just the daily fee that we've reported last week on the data. It's all the add-ons and the transport from going to, barrier trials and things like that. Is there a way of subsidising that? Track fees and things like that. Is that where we try and cut it down?
Yeah, it's something I've spoken to my father about at length recently. Is that I think the main step forward for the racing industry is having changes that affect everybody, rather than affecting factions of the industry. So whether that looks, how that looks, I have my own views, where I would probably prefer there to be training centers where the industry can subsidize parts of whether it's, in Dubai, I've been lucky to travel a bit. In Dubai, they have club vets, that run at more or less cost for the owners, but they're employed by the club. So, and that happens in the United States as well, with their club vets that give a lot of the treatments on race day. So again, different models where all the horses are in the one location, so it's a lot easier to manage. And then track fees, stable rent. I'd love to see a PRA have their own sawdust mill. Like, we're all using sawdust, and commercial sawdust, and we're not the biggest users of that sawdust. They have other uses for it. In fact, one of my clients is one of the big providers of sawdust, and he produces kitchen boards for a living. So we're so dependent upon market forces, when I think we possibly could have a system where we provide, like, it's a bit more vertically integrated, where we supply everything for the industry at a lower cost. Because there's no doubt Australia is not like America. Australia is not like Europe. The wealth in Australia is not as great as those countries, where training fees can keep going up. It's already at a tipping point. We see it in the desire to be a racehorse owner at the moment. So, like, you're in principle, the article that you're discussing about the rising costs is very relevant, but it's what parts you can change. And certainly the training model to change is difficult, because we have to pay the soldiers on the ground enough money to survive. And they're barely getting paid enough to survive as is. Like, if you ask a person in Sydney how far $60,000 gets you on a annual wage, most will say that there's no change in 60,000 for your costs in a week, and I'd attest to that. It's gone to the day where you can start a family and buy a house if you're a stable hand. Like, those days are gone. So, um, it's a really tricky situation. I'd say in principle, most trainers, and I'm not saying all, most trainers subsidize owners' training. I would say most trainers, if there was no prize money, would be trading insolvently. I would think, and I think a lot of if not, certainly there's a good faction of them that rely on the prize money to be able to survive.
That's an interesting, probably relevant point, given the Racing New South Wales licensing situation at the moment, where people's businesses are being scrutinised in terms of whether they're solvent and moving forward. I think part of the challenge, and like you and I had probably, let's say, a pleasant disagreement over Twitter about over Twitter DMs about the context of that article last week and how you saw it in context. It's probably a bit of an attack on the trainers, and we can give our views on that. But I can understand where that perspective comes from, because the communication piece around costs and around the cost of training and ownership, it all belongs with the trainer. Much like a lot of other things, the responsibility sits with the trainers because they sit in the middle of a lot of these things. Is there a broader piece that can be done? And you sort of alluded to it before, where owners can be more educated about this, that if you get into a horse, you actually understand what the costs are about. I mean, it's hard for you as a trainer to go to someone and say, hey, buy a share in a horse, and by the way, this is all the ways you've got to get charged. But is there a broader industry piece that you can sit there and say, look, from an education perspective, these are all the people that are involved in the in the preparation of a horse, and that's why the costs are. And this is the nature of the industry. There's no other way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult. Obviously, when you're trying to get someone to buy into a share in a racehorse, as you said, you're not trying to you're not selling a dream and then telling them that the dream's really expensive. Like, it's probably sales 101. You're not going to divulge that too quickly. I think, fortunately, the syndication model has helped that a bit. People can still get the same experience for a lesser percentage. Which, like, if you own 5%, if you own 10%, a lot of people still feel like it's the same experience. So when you own 5 or 10%, probably 5% of a horse, 10% still becomes quite burdensome for a lot of people. But 5%, I think people can, most people that are getting involved in horses can manage. It doesn't seem to, that's from my experience anyway. But the educating it's a little bit of how much do people care, because when you see the bill's still the same. Like, you explain the bill, most people are still unhappy with the bill. It's just the fact that it's an expensive sport. I think we need to find ways to subsidize owners, and I applaud the stance of Racing Victoria to get more into maidens, because more people win maidens than any other race. So that's a good starting point. But there's still a lot of people that don't win a maiden that are still, shouldering the bill, so to speak. I would like to see track fees and stable rent and waste removal and bedding and things that are just so universally used within the industry, try and reduce people clipping the ticket on that, because that's the sort of thing that I think we should be able to, as an industry, be able to supply. And if we supply it, we control the cost of it. But it takes investment. And as we've talked about before off air, Bren, it's the PRAs don't really control training. The race clubs control training. So while it's still on their agenda for PRAs, it's not really their problem. They've got other problems they want to deal with, I would envision. So trying to make training cheaper and subsidizing race clubs as we've seen with probably the ATC, we've seen it has its challenges as well. If you've got PRAs with race clubs in debt to them. It makes for a bit of a sticky situation, which I don't think anyone likes. The PRAs don't like, and the race clubs don't like. So, I think as a broader industry, we need to try and figure out how we're going to reduce the costs, because I think we're on a nice edge at the moment where people are like, it's becoming unenjoyable seeing so much money get taken out of their pockets before they go to the races. And the prize money is great in Sydney and Melbourne and in Australia generally. But it's just a matter of trying to reduce most horses have sunk probably between $70,000 to $100,000 before they go to the races. So that's on top of yearling prices that have gone up exponentially over the last 20 years. Like it's more consistent than the housing price. The housing market is the yearling market. Like it just keeps going up.
Yeah, there's an argument there that prize money might have played its role in inflating that as well, too, Will, and whether that directing, no trainer's ever going to call for a cut in prize money, but whether directing future prize money towards actually sustaining costs or working towards costs might be a better measure, rather than continuing to sit there and say, yeah, let's put money at the top end and let it flow through. But I mean, I guess that's an interventionist thing. Tim?
I wanted to say, Will, is there, I guess you'd be a medium-sized Sydney stable, perhaps. Is there the advantages of scales we keep talking about? Only yesterday, Will Clarkin and Nicky O'Shea in Adelaide announced they're splitting, mainly because they just can't get the boxes to have that scale to make it pay, to have, I guess, two, trainers, so to speak. How do you manage that scale? Are you looking to grow, or,
Yeah.
to defray some of these costs, I guess?
It's a bit of a contentious one. I was listening to some commentary through the week about what we call the super stables. And I think I don't need to articulate who they are. Most people that know about them know who they are. But it's very hard to grow it's very hard to grow, firstly, because there's a finite amount of boxes, particularly in Sydney. They're very competitive. We saw Lilani Lodge, which needs quite a bit of work, I'm told. So it's that's part of the agenda of taking those boxes. But it's just super competitive for more space. And then the next part is if you can't get to that scale, it's like being in the Premier League and one team has 120 players and the other team has 18. It's like the reality is that it's my fear for racing at the moment, and I'm still very positive about racing as a sport. But I do worry about the sporting element of it. Like, how much of a sport is racing a horse now, and how much of it is just business? And if we move too far away from having a sport, we rely solely on gambling, because there's no enjoyment from a sporting perspective. And I think we've all seen that if we rely solely on gambling, that we're going to be vulnerable to changes in gambling behavior. That's sort of, but in terms of our scale, we're fortunate that Richard lives on a farm at Broke, and we can grow there in time. But certainly boxes in Sydney, unless it seems at the moment, the way that it's occurring is, unless you're one of the big mega powers, it's very hard to grow. They seem to get first preference because they give the most amount of metropolitan city runners, which is, I believe, the criteria for selecting who gets the boxes at the ATC.
I mean, the system does rely on trainers taking a lot of risk, Will, like by its nature, and probably, to its fault to a certain extent. It's obviously that there's a risk of taking on a horse to start with and having to obviously either syndicate or whatever else. There's also the risk of taking on owners where you don't know they're going to pay, and you don't know, where they're coming from in terms of their ability to pay. I mean, is that way of doing business where the trainers who sit in the middle of this take significant amount of risk and move that on, is that sustainable, especially probably towards the middle to lower end? The bigger ones are more like corporations, so they can spread that risk across different aspects. But if you've got, if you've got a few big owners at a medium-sized stable, and you've got, you know, one or two owners that are independently wealthy, they're happy to roll into that, and they run into financial trouble or whatever else. There's a lot of you carry a lot of the can for that, don't you?
Yeah, I think the biggest worry for a trainer is we need a certain amount of horses a year, to I wouldn't say to fill the boxes. Most trainers in the city don't have a huge concern about filling boxes. That's probably a misconception with owners, is that they're just keeping my horse in to fill the box. That's very most trainers don't want horses that can't win races occupying boxes. You're paying staff to look after horses that can't make you as a business any money. But in terms of the risk we're taking, the biggest risk would be we buy a yearling that we spec. So fortunately, we get most trainers, period, have good relationships with Inglis and Magic Millions, the two main sales companies, and we get given a period of credit, whether that be 3 months. It's normally 3 months, or less if you're not proven, had history in the industry, or more. I'd say with some that have a long history in the industry. But we would take the horse home, and while it's insured for death, which is the normal insurance, if it goes into the paddock and it tears its tendon or something like that, it's not to be euthanized, then you can't sell that. So unless you've sold it, it's a huge financial penalty for the risk you're taking on a horse that may or may not generate you money. The most fascinating thing is telling businessmen how our business operates. They just go, "You're mad."
Yeah.
It's you're taking risk on horses that may or may not make you money. And I'm like, yeah, but if you get a good one, it's like that's where you're making your big payday. And I think for most metropolitan stables, that's what they're doing. Most metropolitan stables are treading water until they find a good one or get a good result. So, which is when you go back to the Racing New South Wales licensing situation. It's like, it's pretty year on year. So some years we probably don't make any money, but then another year you can make a lot of money. I remember Jim Bolger in Ireland told me, my business model requires me to sell a stallion every 4 to 6 years.
Yeah.
That's the business model. So it's not just like, he's one of the biggest stables in Ireland. He needs to do the same thing. So that risk, and then the risk of the paying creditors. So the working capital that's required for a thoroughbred business, a training business, is huge, because we're employing so many staff that get paid weekly. So we get to the end of the month and we're like, we need the bills to start getting paid so we don't have to keep putting in more of our own money to subsidize people's late paying. So I think generally bad payers get weaned out pretty quickly. So you can get yourself in a bit of a bind, particularly if you're desperate. And we've been desperate before. We came off the back of bad years, and you've got bad clients that take 60 to 90 days to pay, and you can't afford to lose the client because they buy new stock, but they're putting you under a lot of pressure. And I think the biggest concern for the risk is that we're going to have a very limited country ecosystem, because they're not going to be able to survive. The costs keep going up for them as well. Like my staffing costs in Scone were not much different to Sydney. I just couldn't afford as many staff in Scone, and we're competing against lesser competition, so we probably don't need to do the extra 1% that you need to do in Sydney to be able to compete.
We've talked a lot about the challenges, Will, but there's still an exciting game, as you say, chasing the dream and the good horse. Is that what gets you up in the morning? And you do work with your father and partner, and
that doesn't
working
get
with
me up in the
family, and
morning.
yeah. So
Working with your father does not get me up in the morning. And that's not just him. I think most people that work with a sibling or my partner's also involved in the business. So it's just like, it's a full family affair. So like most people, when they're like, 18 years old, want to get away from the family. Well, I'm 33 and I'm still here. But it's a fulfilling job. It really is. We do it for the lifestyle. It's a very tangible result. So it's like you win or you don't win. It's not like marketing where you sort of have to gauge your influence through different forces and KPIs. It's like, no. If you're training well and you've got the right horses, you win races. And you're chasing that horse that can run in an Everest or run in a Melbourne Cup. It 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 at times it seems challenging, but we're relentless in trying to find the next champion and nurture it. Like, I think the most exciting part for a city stable is when your 2-year-olds come through, because you know what your older horses are likely to do. They don't improve. Um, More times than not, they don't improve to a point where you're surprised. But your young stock is where it's all at, and like that, our babies are coming through now, and it's like it's where the real art of being able to judge as a horse trainer when to pull the trigger and when to pull back, and to make sure you're communicating to your owners that they that they the reasons why you're pulling back and why you need patience, or the other part where you're like, no, it's full system go. We need to try and win a couple of 2-year-old races with this and see if we can make it into a stallion. So we're going through that period now, and that's above all else, that's probably what I find the most enjoyable is reading the horses and trying to figure out where to place them. I mean, it'd be easier if they told you, but if it was easier, then everyone would do it.
Just one last one, Will, before on those young horses coming through, you might end up on an ad or something, but with the Stay Insides, Tiger of Malays, I'm not sure if you've got any wild rulers, but certainly, your father and yourself had a lot to do with Stay Inside and Tiger of Malay.
Yeah, we've had a couple of Tiger and Malays. We've got a few. We've probably got 4 or 5 Stay Insides in the barn. They're all showing. I mean, the Stay Insides are probably showing a little bit more precocity than the Tiger and Malays. Even though he sort of won as a 2-year-old, he was a bigger type of. I think he was a son of Extreme Choice as well, Tiger Malay. But the Stay Insides, they look sharp. I'd be surprised if you don't see a handful of them pop up early, really early. But like, it's funny, they always keep trying to second guess the older stallions, and you still find when they come in the barn, those older stallions, they still find quality. They've got quality mares, but I'd probably say from what we've seen so far, the Stay Insides and the Home Affairs. They were probably the 2 standout stallions so far that we've seen. And while we've only got a moderate sample size, they're probably the 2 standouts.
Well, we could probably talk for a very long time about many different things, but really appreciate your time. It's always good to catch up and give that perspective, and all the best for the spring coming up.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
The following segment is sponsored by Inglis. Group 1 winning 2-year-old Velocious highlights the late July English digital sale, which goes live on Friday, July 25. The Dora Rick Tycoon is one of only 4 champion New Zealand 2-year-olds to be offered off the track over the past 10 years, the others being Melody Bell, Avantage and Maven Bell. Her highlight victory came in the Group 1 Sistema Stakes, defeating subsequent Group 1 winners Captured by Love and Savagely. She's one of only 6 fillies to have won that race over the past 20 years. Velocious is currently at Vinery Stud and available inspections by contacting Adam White or David White at Vinery. The full late July English digital sale catalogue is available on the new look englishdigital.com.au and runs until Wednesday, July 30th. Okay, Tim, on to breeding and bloodstock news now, and run the numbers this week. Column, obviously, I pen every week. Looked at the number of, or the lack of number of 2-year-old runners and the decline of the number of 2-year-old runners in Australian racing. It's an interesting time to sort of reflect on this at the end of the season. Australia's always well renowned for its 2-year-old racing, but percentage-wise, in terms of the number of 2-year-olds and also the number of 2-year-old feature races that we run and all those types of things, we're actually behind most of the other major jurisdictions in Australia. The key numbers, I think, is that since 2019-20, when the number of 2-year-olds competing in Australian races 2,840, we estimate to be around 2,150 this season. The season's not finished yet, obviously. That's a significant drop, Tim. The article sort of alludes to a few factors, but in your mind, what sort of stands out as the key factor behind the lack of 2-year-old participation?
Well, obviously the foal crops drops. Only a certain percentage of those horses are going to be talented enough and strong enough and have the constitution to get to 2-year-old races. I don't think as I wrote in
But
the
the
news,
overall number of horses hasn't dropped, participation. So the participation of 2-year-olds has dropped from 10% 5 years ago of the overall racing population to 7.4%. I mean, that's a significant drop.
and I think there is good prize money in 3-year-old races, older. If you've got a good horse, and as Will touched on, it's very expensive to have a horse in training. If you do have a good horse and you can look after them, you can win a lot of prize money as those older races. So you don't need to churn them up to, hope to. And I think only one horse can win a Golden Slipper. Yes, and if you win it, you win, and it's a colt, you win the jackpot. But you can't. Do you look? I guess the patience is there's a patience there, and maybe the proliferation of shuttle stallions that probably take a little bit more time. Things like that. Yeah, all little factors, and I think it's just probably the trainers showing a bit more patience with their, largely expensive horses.
Yeah,
And
it is.
I should say also, Bren, sorry, that country trainers aren't buying as many yearlings, so they're buying tried horses. So therefore, there's less need for 2-year-old races in the country. And from my region, I can only think of a handful of 2-year-old races outside Canberra, for instance, that have been run this season, and the season's nearly over.
Yeah, and I think programming is a part of it, Tim. And I think that's also been driven a little bit, especially in the metro level, by wagering returns. There was a perception, or rightly or wrongly, and it's probably right in terms of whether 2-year-old racing returns, unraced 2-year-olds return the same wagering returns. I'm not too sure how you measure that when some of the 2-year-old races are being held at 11:15. But from my perspective, I think the programming, there is a competing priority there about wagering, which, don't get me wrong, is crucially important, but also the need to provide platforms for 2-year-olds to come through and to have that. And history tells us that horses, even if they don't win as 2-year-olds, Tim, if they race as 2-year-olds, they tend to come through as better 3-year-olds anyway, rather than be waiting into a 3-year-old. So it's an interesting situation. I guess the other point, which I'll put a sort of end on this discussion around, is that we still have 72 or 73, depending what year it is, black type stakes races in Australia. We still have, 5 group runs, all that type of stuff. I think 10, 15 years ago, it was 1 in 40 horses that won a race, 2-year-olds, sorry, that won a race in Australia, won a juvenile stakes race. Now it's 1 in 28. The concern is there that you're rewarding, that the pattern is not moving to the changes in the thing, and reducing juvenile stakes races. I'm not saying that should necessarily happen, but if we keep going down that path, we can't keep rewarding a smaller and smaller population of horses with black type. Now, there's plenty of areas where you can apply that same thinking too, but this is just one of them. One aspect, or one horse that doesn't have any problem with juvenile winners or any form of winners whatsoever, is I'm Invincible. 200 seasonal winners again. I think it's his 3rd time too. We were having this discussion yesterday that he's achieved that remarkable achievement. He won't win a 4th straight Australian title. Zoustar will win that, which is significant enough in itself, and we'll revisit that in the next couple of weeks about Zoustar, anything of Zoustar. But it's an interesting point. I guess Vinny's getting as many winners as ever. Probably not likely to have a downturn in his number of runners. Moving forward, do you feel like the Zoustar winning the title is a change in the guard, or do we see the fact that I'm Invincible in particular, probably Snitzel less so because obviously no longer winners, but also his numbers did decline a little bit, are going to be able to sort of fight back and and claim these size championship, albeit things like the Everest have an outsized influence on them.
Well, that's right. You say those rich races have such an influence on the overall title just because of the prize money earnings. We've seen that Pride of Dubai's possibly going to run second this year, basically off, he's had some good horses, but Bella Nipotina and Pride of Jenny. So it just shows how much that can influence it. That I'm Invincible's got some very nice horses, young horses coming through that have been well looked after, like Vin Rock, and I think he ran second in the JJ Atkins with a nice colt that's, only lightly raced. But Zoustar's younger than I'm Invincible, and naturally those older stallions are well looked after and they don't serve as bigger books, so therefore fewer runners coming through. Where Zoustar at this stage, fertility is good, I believe, and going to be able to cover bigger books. So you think he's well placed given his popularity the last few years, certainly commercially as well. So, the bigger breeders with the best mares can justify paying a big service fee to go to him, and he's well placed to maybe add to it what he's going to win this year as a general premiership. He's been expected to almost from day one, with Sunlight coming out of his first crop that he's in the next generation. With the dominance of I'm Invincible and Sitzel before that, it's possibly taken a year or two longer than some expected, but he's going to be well placed to add to his one title.
Do you want to touch on the never-ending sales season we're in, Tim? I mean, it's probably better for him and for us this time of year when we're scratching around trying to look for stories. But we spoke last week with Inglis's Angus Robertson about the strong results of English Digital. We have a Group 1 winner, Velocious, as mentioned, selling on that platform next week. We've got the Magic Millions virtual sale in early August, where we've got some high-profile horses likely to do quite well. Is this the new reality, Tim, that we live in this sort of, 24/7, 12 months a year sales cycle, and that, the liquidity of the market means that it's only going to continue at this pace or even get stronger in terms of the amount of horses being offered through these platforms?
No, it is. Just such a liquid market now to trade tried horses or brood mares, not having to wait for the live sales, 2 or 3 times a year. And we saw a great Southern sale, no broodmare session this year in June for the first time, possibly ever. So it's just changed that it's very easy to trade horses on English Digital and through Magic Millions on a virtual sale, and whether they go, I believe they're investing a lot of time and effort and money into having an online sale presence again at some point. So it's just the new reality that, as you say, that to be able to trade horses easily online.
Yeah, and it's probably in Australia, we've got a very broad ownership base. It works quite well because we do have broad ownership bases with great strength of Australian racing, that, there's a lot of opportunities to do that. And maybe that's part of the challenge about the 2-year-old discussion we were having earlier, Tim, is that the fact that, these markets are so vibrant from a tried racehorse point of view that small to medium trainers are much better off. And Will alluded to this too in his discussion before, that if you have to wait for a horse any good and you hold that risk, it's a significant risk for trainers. So it's, from a training perspective, from a business perspective, we're better off buying a 3-year-old that might not have made city grade rather than, plunking a hope on a yearling. So it's interesting time for Australian bloodstock, and it certainly has been a significant change over the past few years. The following segment is brought to you by Darley. Let's talk about what makes a stallion stand out. First, the pedigree. Buy a champion sire out of a Group 3 winning Street Cry mare, and that Danehill Street Cry cross that's produced the likes of Farnan and Animo. Now the performance. Silver Slipper winner, Todman winner, runner-up in the Golden Slipper. But here's the clincher. He trained on, came back at 3, won the Vane, and then won the Newmarket. When you put it all together, it's hard to argue. Cylinder, standing at Darley. Finally, Tim, this week in wagering, I don't want to sort of become the bulletin board for PointsBet and BetR, but it's been obviously a long-running saga, and I don't want to bore people with the details. But what was interesting about the correspondence that came out with PointsBet yesterday was a comment that BetR's high reliance on racing customers was seen as a net negative by the PointsBet board in its possible acquisition. Now, the details of which you can sort of get yourself au fait with. But on a more general point, Tim, what this probably points to is the challenge racing has got when sport is seen as a much more profitable and desirable medium to bet in from the bookmakers' perspective, to offer markets in, than racing. What's the long-term implications of this do you feel, Tim, if we end up in a situation where bookies are just going to continue to prioritise sport over racing because they've got a responsibility to their shareholders and to profitability? Racing has a significant challenge in this regard, doesn't it?
It does. And, we've seen with, the pullback of the generosities, the free bets and, money back second and third, that's been reined in with, whatever the federal government, if and when they ever act on the you win some, lose more report. There's the lack of incentive for bookies to provide those generosities. They don't compete on price anymore because of the taxation, and there's again, I can't blame them. There's no incentive to compete on odds and price, and use opinion in shaping their odds to racing punters. So it's just the I don't want to use it again from 2 segments in a row, but yeah, it is the new reality of just the way it is. And PRAs, I guess, if they and the governments decide that they lessen the taxes, maybe there's more incentive for bookies to point their punters in a different direction on to racing. And yeah, just interesting to see how it plays out.
I wonder what that looks like for the next generation. Both you and I have got sons who are in their early teens or in their teens who are you know who are probably the next generation of people, given that their genetic predilection for a bet, are likely to go on and do that, and whether sport becomes such a significant part more. I was actually having a discussion yesterday with my own son about the desirabilities of various forms of betting and all that sort of stuff, and why sport has become such a key part of it, because it's a very simple medium to understand. And like when you or I were growing up, Tim, to be perfectly honest, and I don't want to necessarily put you, you're a little bit younger than me, but you couldn't really bet on sport. Like you'd go to a tab and put on a sports bet or whatever else, but it wasn't the same way. It wasn't all, part of the process. And I think racing has got a challenge on its hand to market to those next generation to say, why is racing a medium I would bet on? Like, to be perfectly honest, it's complex, it's difficult. There's things I don't understand about it. I can sit down and watch a footy game and understand player A, player B. And and I know, Tim, the last probably 15, 20 years, started off with things like, the fantasy leagues and dream teams and stuff. These kids these days, I mean, we knew a lot about footballers growing up, but my God, they know every single footballer, every single kick, every single stat. Whether it's desirable for them to then be referring that in the gambling context, I can see concerns around that. But I think from a broader context, racing, you and I probably grew up talking about form. They're not talking about form. Why would you need to know about form when we can do both things at once? Effectively, what's the sport that you like to watch and have a bet on it as well? I'm not encouraging kids to do that as young teenagers, but as things get older, it's just part of the culture in my mind. Speaking of corporate bookies, Tim, and I believe you have some insight into some of the turnover they're generating in Australia, from Australian punters on international racing.
Yeah, obviously Malaysia, which I like to follow, and it's been in the news for arguably the wrong reasons, with a jockey inquiry who Lai D'Souza, who was suspended for 18 months, and in reality is really 30 months at least before he's allowed to reapply for his license. But the Selangor Turf Club in Kuala Lumpur did have it was a $1 million ringgit race for 4-year-olds called the Selangor Mile. It's their biggest race. Well, it's the first time they've run it, but the richest race they've held since COVID. Really did suffer. Racing was shut down there, and a lot of jurisdictions. These figures I've received or been told about, you got to take into context that there's no longer Singapore racing, so there is going to be some movement across to Malaysia, but it's up. The same corresponding period after Sunday's meeting, it's up 43% year on year. They had as I said, I've been watching it in some of the contacts, and they've had a lot of people there on Sunday. Internationals, Jenny Chapman and David Price, that people would know were there. They had a runner. There's been some Aussie jockeys going up. Clint Johnson Porter rode up there on Sunday from WA. Blake McDougall's been going up and riding well. He unfortunately was suspended. Will Price rode a winner when he went up there a month or two ago. So it's a moving industry if they can keep progressing forward outside the negative headlines. And it just shows with Selangor Mile, with turnover of, between Tab and Tab Touch WA, that is set up 43%. That's roughly almost 15 million Aussie bet just on Selangor this year. So it's not a small amount of money. It's
just through
important
those two agencies. Just through those two agencies, Tim. So that's it doesn't count a lot of the other ones as well.
Yeah, it doesn't count
sports
bet
well.
and yes. People might say you can't get on or whatever. Yes, it's challenging, and they bet 160%, but the markets are volatile. The markets are volatile, but you can, it's still not a small amount of money being bet. So, and it's growing all the time, especially if they can get the Aussie jockeys up there and the bigger races and momentum. That Selangor Mile for 4-year-olds might be worth up to 2 million ringgit, which would be about sort of closer to 800,000 Aussie, I think. So, it's a significant race. If we can find Bren, we should find a horse that can't just about to turn 4-year-old, send it up there.
what is interesting there, probably timing wise, it worked well from this weekend because the end of Hong Kong racing probably plays into that a little bit because you've got those punters that are naturally sort of moving on through there. But it is interesting, and it's probably broader throughout Asian racing as well as global racing. It is a global sport these days, and I guess the challenge for local PRAs is if money is going elsewhere as well, what does that mean for the funding of the local sport? So there's probably some questions there for the local PRAs about how they're going to retain some of that value and ensure that. And then to be perfectly honest, if the fees are less for that racing from a corporate bookmaker perspective, we go back to that conversation we just had before, whether that then leads to greater turnover driving through other means and local racing suffering for it. Thanks for joining us on Straight Talk, brought to you by our sponsors, Inglis and Darley. Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you're listening to us, be it on Apple, Podbean, YouTube, Spotify, whole range of platforms you can listen to us on. Be sure to subscribe. Send us an email, editor@thestraight.com.au. Again, we'll get a few questions together for a Q&A episode coming forward. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you again next week.